Let's open our Bibles now, whether you're online or in the room, to Exodus chapter 16. We're continuing our line-by-line, paragraph-by-paragraph study of this phenomenal book, Exodus. And this morning we'll be here in chapter 16, focusing on verses 1 through 21. And as you're turning there, I just have a question that I'd like to begin by asking you this morning. I do want some group participation. So raise your hand, please, if this applies to you. Ready? How many of you, 1 year from today, would like to be able to say, I have grown in my relationship with God over the last year? If you want to be able to say that a year from now, raise your hand. I would hope that's every hand, right? I would hope everyone would say something like that regardless of what God does in the next year, what He allows, what I experience, I want to be able to say on this day in 2025, I know God better. I've experienced more of Him. I understand Him in new, fresh ways as a result of the last calendar year. And so if that's going to be true a year from now, I think it makes sense then to ask this follow-up question today. How then does someone actually grow in their relationship with God? If we want that to be true in 2025, we should be thinking about how is that going to happen over the next 365 days, right? And in answer to that, many of us probably immediately start thinking of spiritual disciplines. Things like reading your Bible, things like going to church faithfully, spending time faithfully in prayer with the Lord, gathering with His people. Like at Keystone, in fact, we programatize that. We say things like worshiping in services and living in groups and growing in studies and serving on teams. And certainly, God uses all of those things. Those are all very important things. But what I want you to see today is that Scripture actually says that there is another tool that God probably most frequently uses in the development and the growth of His people. And it's probably not the one that we would sign up for willingly, but it is the one that He uses most often, and it is called the wilderness. The wilderness. He doesn't actually, in fact, usually grow us in the ways that we would desire, right? It's not usually through comfortable settings. It's not usually just through a book study. It's through the pain points in life, the seasons that we would call the wilderness times of trial and hardship and difficulty. We just see it time and time again throughout Scripture that He leads His people directly into desert seasons in order to teach them to depend on Him, to shape their character, and to deepen their trust in Him. Back in 2003, there was a hiker named Aaron Ralston. Here's his picture. He set out for solitude in Utah's Blue John Canyon. And that's a very rugged part of our country where there is desert, and it offered a degree of adventure that he was seeking, but there was one particular moment that changed his entire life. There was a boulder that fell from up above and trapped his arm, leaving him completely alone and unable to escape from underneath the weight of that boulder. And out there in the wilderness, he had no cell service. He couldn't call anybody to ask for help, and there was no one within miles who would hear his voice as he was calling out. And so for 5 straight days, he's trapped under that boulder without any food or water. He's facing the blazing hot sun by day and then the freezing temperatures of the desert by night. And he tells his story that hour by hour he became more and more aware that he might not actually survive this. He might not make it through this time of tragedy. And finally, feeling like he had nothing else to lose, Aaron reports that he did the unimaginable. He took out his pocket knife and he amputated his own arm to escape and to find salvation, to free himself from underneath that rock. He's written a book about it, and he describes that time in his life, that time in the canyon, as the ultimate test of survival and courage and inner strength, that it defined who he is for the rest of his life. And I want to say to you today, that's what deserts do. Deserts do exactly like that thing. They strip us of everything that we usually find comfort in, right? They reveal what's really inside of us, what we're really made of. That they show us those areas where we're stuck or we're alone like Aaron, or we can't find our way forward. And the truth is, God actually leads us into places like that on purpose for those very reasons, to test what's really in our hearts and to show us where growth is needed, where we're really depending for our true strength. This morning we're going to see that exact thing in the life of Israel. It's just been 1 month since they had their dramatic rescue from Egypt, and here they are. They're going to face yet another test, another chance to trust God by faith, another chance to lift their voices in gratitude or choose to grumble and complain. And the circumstance they're going to face this time is hunger. They're desperate. They're in the wilderness. They're in the desert. And they act as if God has failed them. You would think by looking at them that they have experienced nothing good from this God in heaven, right? That they act as if there's no hope in trusting him for security and abundance in this moment. And so on the surface, I find that a bit surprising, don't you? I mean, they had, as a people, seen God's power on display in ways that most of us in our day have never even come close to seeing, right? The parting of the Red Sea, the 10 plagues in Egypt, his provision just in the previous chapter at Marah to turn bitter water into sweet water and then to lead them to Elim where there was that time of refreshment. I mean, you would think that at this point in the story, they would be people of strong faith. People willing to say, God, whatever you want, wherever you lead, whatever you desire, that's what we want because you've proven that you are trustworthy. And so it doesn't matter what we're facing in this wilderness. We know the God we're following and we know that he will take care of us. But before we judge them too harshly, let's be honest. Aren't we the same? I mean, how often is it you and me who's standing there saying, if only I could change my job, right? If only I could get out of this situation. If only I could change my circumstances or get a different marriage or find a new friend, right? Like, then I would be able to finally trust God. I mean, how soon are we, like Israel, to forget his past faithfulness and once again demand that he prove himself again? See, here's the truth. God isn't just interested in changing our circumstances. He's interested in changing us. And he knows that if we can't trust him in the wilderness, there is not much hope that we're going to trust him in the promised land when things are going really well in our lives. And so that's why he leads us into deserts, to reveal what is actually in our hearts and to use those as opportunities to transform us. And so what I want to say to you today is every single one of you sitting here today is going to face a wilderness season. Maybe you already have, maybe you are currently, but if not, it's coming. I'm just telling you. A time when the path won't be clear, when the needs won't be met in the way that you expect for them to be met, right? And there's going to be this temptation to complain in that moment. But what we're going to learn from Exodus 16 is that complaints are not just words. They reveal where our trust really lies. And it's in those moments that our attitude really becomes the lens through which we see God work or we miss it entirely. And so as we look at Exodus 16, I just want you from the outset to start examining your attitude about life, about your circumstances. Where is God calling you to surrender your complaints and actually take a hard look at his goodness in your life, to see his hand at work? Where's he inviting you to trust him more fully where you've been resisting? See, God's goal is not just to get you through the wilderness, friend. It's to transform you in the wilderness. I'm calling today's sermon Wilderness Lessons in Trust. And I would invite you to join me now in Exodus 16 and follow along silently as I begin reading God's words out loud. I'm going to start in verse 1. And let's ask the Spirit to help us learn to live in light of these words right now. In Exodus 16:1, the word of the Lord says, they set out from Elim, and all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. And the whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the people of Israel said to them, would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the meat pots and ate bread to the full. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. I mean, what in the world, right? I mean, they're a little off in their recollection of the facts, wouldn't you say? And what a terrible attitude toward the God who had delivered them time and time and time again, to now literally say, it would have been better to stay in Egypt, right? I mean, unbelievable. But listen, Israel's attitude problem did not actually start in the wilderness, was it? Or did it? Right? That's not where it began. It was exposed in the wilderness, but it didn't begin there. The journey is just revealing what they actually believed to be true about God, about his character, about his care for them. They weren't just hungry. Now, that's all they're thinking about. But what was actually going on is that they are spiritually discontent. They are spiritually hungry. They're looking back at Egypt with these rose-colored glasses, and they're totally forgetting about the bondage, right? They're reimagining it as if it was a paradise. The real obstacle is not the desert around them, it's the desert inside of them. It's their refusal to trust God in the wilderness. And so God's using the wilderness. He's using it to reshape and reform the attitude of their heart. And so every complaint that comes out is a step backward in that process. It's just delaying the inevitable. It's guaranteeing more time in the desert wilderness, right? That rejection of trust in this season to believe that God would actually care for them as he has led them into this place. Their grumbling is the thing that's blinding them to God's provision. It's robbing them of peace. And I just want to say to you, that's what ungrateful attitudes do. When they are left unchecked in our hearts, grumbling will take us nowhere but down, friends. It never ends in a good place, right? It's going to make us focus on what we lack instead of what God has already given and what he promises to provide. Again, that's why he led them here. That's why they're in the wilderness. He could have, think about it, he could have taken them straight to the promised land, right? It wasn't that far away. He could have gotten them there quickly. So this is not a mistake. This is intentional. He's brought them into the desert on purpose to address the needs of their heart. He didn't just want to get his people out of Egypt. He wanted to get Egypt out of his people. Because if they couldn't trust him in the wilderness, they would never trust him in the promised land. Here's the big idea for today's passage. I'd encourage you to write this down if you're a note taker. God tests me in the wilderness to deepen my trust in him. See, God isn't just interested in getting us out of difficult situations. He's interested in leading us into a new way of thinking, a new way of living, a way of gratitude, a way of trust, a way of faith. And so the wilderness seasons are helpful to that end. They expose what's in our hearts. The wilderness wasn't Israel's problem. Their attitude was their problem. And so it wasn't the desert that was holding them back from their promised end. It was their own ungrateful hearts. And this passage makes it very clear that every single wilderness test was designed by God to produce 5 very specific responses that he desires to see in his people whenever we find ourselves in wilderness situations. 5 areas where he applies providential pressure to bring his purposes to the surface of our hearts. We see the first one here in verse 1, so look at that again where it says, they set out from Elim. And all the congregation of the people of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai on the 15th day of the 2nd month after they had departed from the land of Egypt. Here's the first response to God's wilderness tests. When God tests, point number 1, embrace the experience. Lean into it. Embrace it. All right, notice again in verse 1, we see that it's been 1 month now since Israel's miraculous escape from Egypt. You see that? And they've just left Elim. We saw that last week, that oasis of 12 springs and 70 palm springs and a place of rest and refreshment. They probably hoped that all the difficult stuff was behind them. And yet here they are again, journeying even deeper into this barren wilderness called, look what it says, wilderness of sin. Sounds pretty ominous, doesn't it? I mean, I read that and I'm thinking like that can't possibly end well, right? You're literally going into the wilderness of sin. If this was a movie, we'd be hearing like the lush, joyous string section playing the soundtrack at Elim, and then it would sort of turn to the lo-fi, ominous beats as we go into the wilderness of sin, right? But this is not the Lord of the Rings, and so no fear. That's not what this is about at all. In fact, sin here should not be confused with our English word sin at all. The wilderness of sin has nothing to do with sin. It's just a geographic location that might actually be related to Sinai. That's the other place mentioned here. That's where they're ultimately headed. But there is a harsh landscape there, and it's going to be all around them, and it's going to be the perfect backdrop for everything that God wants to unfold in this moment. The wilderness of sin, that's going to become the classroom. That's where the hearts of God's people are going to be revealed. And so the memory of Pharaoh's oppression, that may be like fading in their memory, but they're going to have fresh challenges to face, right? They're going to have new difficulties. And it's going to take place in this barren wasteland. The wilderness of sin, the desert, it's unforgiving, it's harsh, and it's going to bring their insecurities to the surface. It's the place of testing. Their true character and trust in God will be revealed. It's going to come into focus. Will they trust him in this wilderness or not? Verse 2 tells us the whole congregation, here's how they respond, initially anyway. The whole congregation, 2 million people, remember? The whole congregation of the people of Israel grumbled. That was their response. Grumbled against Moses and Aaron. So it's not just a few voices of discontent. It's not just a couple rogue leaders who aren't getting along with Moses and Aaron, right? No, this is spreading through the whole camp, this murmuring. It's like a wildfire. It's taking down the whole congregation. And it's not quiet. It's urgent. It's desperate. It's contagious. They're not shy about their complaints. They're not standing in back rooms murmuring. It's becoming the known thing in the whole camp, right? Their frustration. It's escalating. And it's built on their lack of trust in God to provide for him. Look at the accusation in verse 3. Would that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt when we sat by those meat pots. Oh, the meat pots. We ate the bread to the full. Man, Egypt had some good bread, some good meat pots. What I wouldn't give for a meat pot about now, right? I mean, what in the world are they talking about? In one sentence, they have rewritten history. Like, this is not how their lives were going in Egypt, right? They've transformed it from a place of suffering and slavery. Like, we've been reading about that for chapters, the horrific treatment they experienced in Egypt. It was not a place of abundance and paradise, not for them. I mean, they might have been serving the Egyptians some meat pots, but they weren't grazing in a buffet themselves, right? This revisionist history shows us how distorted their perspective has really become. It's like a complete reinvention of reality. And, you know, I just find that how striking it is often that hardship can do that in our lives, right? When the present feels uncertain or difficult, all of a sudden our mind starts to reshape the past. We start to forget about how God has already delivered us from long-held challenges and difficulties. Maybe it's some addiction in your life, and God freed you from that. But now in this season, because you're facing another hardship, it's like all of a sudden that thing starts to beckon you back to what once enslaved you. See, this isn't just Israel's problem. It's a human problem. How often do we romanticize the past when life gets hard in the present? How often do we idealize what God called us out of simply because we're uncomfortable with what he's laid before us in this season, right? The temptation is always to look back and think it was better than it actually was, instead of embracing what God is doing today. Israel's selective memory here is revealing once again that their hearts are slow to trust their God. They are very quick to complain. They are very eager to get back to something that looks comfortable, right? They didn't like the bondage, but they sure don't like this either. And their complaints, while directed at Moses and Aaron, I don't want you to miss this, they are ultimately against God. Moses makes that very clear. Look at verse 8. Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord. You see that? So their frustration is not just about food, ultimately. It's rooted in unbelief. It's rooted in doubting God's goodness and his care and his plan for their lives. See, that's what grumbling is in the scripture. You need to know this. Grumbling is not minor. It's always an act of unbelief. It's always a rejection of God's sovereignty and care for us, for those that we love, right? The Israelites' attitude here, it's reflecting a distorted view of God himself, as though he just exists to serve us, to give us things, to keep us comfortable, to give us wishes like a genie in a bottle, right? That they had already seen God come to their aid as provider and protector. He'd already comforted them, right? He's not a leader that cannot be trusted, but he's showing them now that he loves something even more than giving them good gifts. He loves to transform his people into different people. That's the end goal. But they still have this consumer mindset when it comes to their relationship with him. As theologian Don Carson puts it, Israel saw God as existing to serve them. He served them in the Exodus. He served them when he provided clean water. And now he must serve not only their needs, but their appetites. It's like, God, get on with it, right? My wish should be your command. And this is a serious warning for us. Have we fallen into this same error, thinking that God's role in our lives is simply to provide for our comfort? Or can we recognize today that he's actually calling us to trust him in any and every circumstances, especially when the road is hard and uncertain that lies before us? And yet, don't miss the fact, don't miss how God responds here. This is amazing. He doesn't reject them in this moment. He doesn't punish them. Instead, he uses this opportunity, this classroom of the wilderness, to refine their faith. The wilderness is stripping them down. It's tearing down all these false illusions of self-sufficiency, and it's teaching them to truly depend on him and him alone, right? Their complaining may have been misguided, but it becomes an opportunity for God then to reveal his provision and faithfulness once again in incredible ways. Later, Deuteronomy 8:2 will reflect on this exact episode when it says, "And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart." See, that's what God was after. Whether you would keep his commandments or not. It was a test. The wilderness wasn't punishment. It was spiritual training for something else. God was revealing their hearts and inviting them to trust him in more deep ways. And this is always why we're called to embrace the wilderness experience, because God doesn't lead us into hardship to harm us. The point is that he wants to grow us, right? That's the purpose of trials. He's teaching us to depend on him. It's like James says, James 1:2-3, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know," here it is, "that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." The trials you're facing, they're tests. They're designed to produce steadfastness in your relationship with God. It's like the marathon runner who, I've heard runners talk about this. I would not know this by personal experience at all. But marathon runners will talk about this moment when they'll say, we hit a wall psychologically, and it comes like late in the race, maybe around mile 20 or 21, and they're so exhausted, and they're starving, and their energy is depleted, and all those things, the hunger starts to cloud their thoughts. They start to get really frustrated. They had all this like energy psyched up before the race, but now all of a sudden it's like this psychological battle of like, why am I doing this anyway, right? That they start imagining their couch back home and their stocked refrigerator and an ice cold Gatorade, and all of a sudden they start rationalizing why quitting would actually make sense, even though they're almost there, right? And some will even convince themselves that they should have never run this race in the first place, even though it's right there for the grasping, right at the end. That's where Israel is in this text. It's their hunger that is the circumstance that is ramping up their frustration, and that's real for sure. But instead of turning to God in this moment, they're letting complaints take over. And they're rewriting history as a result. They're reimagining Egypt as a land of abundance, forgetting God's miraculous deliverance to get them out of that horrific situation. Their grumbling is blinding them to God's provision, and it's making their situation feel unbearable. Yeah, it's unbearable if it's depending on you, right? If you can't trust God, you're right. There is no hope in this situation. And that's where they're at right now. They've become so focused on what they lack that they've totally lost sight of what God has already done and what he's able to do in the future. And so it's in this vulnerable moment that they actually had a choice. It didn't have to go this way. They had two options on the table. They could cry out to the God who rescued them, right? That could have been another option here, but they chose instead option 2, to let complaints consume them. And unfortunately, as they choose grumbling, their discontent is spreading all throughout the entire community. They're all collectively now doubting God's goodness. And I would just say in a church, this is our danger. This is the danger of unchecked grumbling behind the scenes. It starts to cloud our vision. It starts to harden our hearts, and it causes us to question God's faithfulness to us as a church family. Complaints become spiritual cancer. They start to eat away at every remaining evidence of gratitude that exists. Don't be a part of that, and repent of it if you have been. You know, what does it mean to actually embrace the wilderness experience as the test that God has designed it for? It means resisting this urge to romanticize the past, because familiarity, even if it's painful, is not better, right? Don't go back there. Sometimes we think that it would be better if I just went back. No, it's not better. God's leading us forward. He's not going to abandon us in this moment. The same God who has rescued us in the past is going to be faithful to us in the future. But this also calls us to be on guard in our hearts against grumbling. And instead of letting frustration take root like they did, we're actually invited to bring those needs to God, aren't we? We're supposed to be trusting him that he hears us and he cares for us. And if we're not on guard against this, grumbling will have the same effect that it did for them. It will blind us to the fact that God's already at work. And finally, it means accepting the wilderness as God's tool for our growth. He's not leading us into these difficult situations to harm us, but to refine us. The whole purpose is to deepen our faith and show us that he really is enough. The wilderness is not the end, friend. I don't know what your wilderness is, but it's not the end. It's just part of the process. God's using it to take you to a better place. And here's the second lesson that he wants you to learn in his wilderness classroom. When God tests, point number 2, trust God's timing. Trust God's timing. Look at verse 4. Then the Lord said to Moses, behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you. And the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. On the 6th day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather daily. I mean, wow, did you see that coming? Like, if you've never read this before, you're like, after the complaining and the grumbling, like, I didn't see, like, bread from heaven coming from God in this moment, right? Like, how gracious of him to give them what they needed in spite of their complaining spirits and their bad attitudes. But I want you to see this. His response is not this, like, immediate, overwhelming flood of provision. He's not going to erase all of their uncertainty and fear, like, in a single moment. Instead, he's going to provide sustenance for them, get this, one day at a time. One day at a time, he's going to provide for them, along with some very specific instructions if they actually want to enjoy that provision, right? This is going to require some daily rhythms of trust, regular coming back to once again claim God's provision and completely counter all of those other expectations and doubts and fears that were driving the complaints of their hearts. It's this daily nature of the manna that was the most intentional part about it. It wasn't just about meeting their physical needs in a moment. It was cultivating spiritual dependence on an ongoing basis. Now, I want you to imagine being an Israelite here, accustomed to the rhythms of planting and harvesting and storing as you worked as a slave in the nation of Egypt previously. And now all of a sudden, it's like God has flipped the script, right? Instead of having the opportunity to stockpile resources in order to have abundance long term, God says, no, you're just going to have enough for one day at a time. And you're not going to hold it over for the next day. You can't rely on yesterday's bread or yesterday's storehouse for tomorrow's need. And so by providing only a portion every day, God is inviting, once again, his people to trust him on an ongoing basis. Trust his daily provision. It's coming every morning. Believe that it's coming and claim it every morning, right? Don Carson, again, he observes the daily manna required them to trust God afresh each morning, with no assurances for the future beyond his character, right? The only way we're going to see bread in the morning is if God keeps his word. He said he'll bring it. We're going to trust that he brings it, right? We're not going to store any up because he's going to bring more in the morning. This isn't about accumulating. It's about returning to him once and again, right? Over and over again. Relying on God's faithfulness one day at a time. And I think over time it had to have an effect of building patience in these people as well as their obedience is tested. Look at verse 5 there where it tells us that on the 6th day there was additional instruction that they were to gather twice as much so that they could then rest on the Sabbath. See that? All right? So this is about more than food. Again, this is about establishing a certain rhythm in their lives. One that would include work and rest, but trusting God in both scenarios, right? And so by gathering extra on this 6th day, they were going to trust God's provision to sustain them through that weekend, through a couple days. It was a tangible lesson in God's reliability. When we follow his instructions, we can find as well that his provision is always timely, friends. It's always enough. It's always complete. It always brings rest and peace in ways that what the world would promise can never provide for us. In fact, sometimes trusting God's timing in these ways can feel a bit counterintuitive to the way that our world messages us all the time, especially when it seems like his provisions are delayed in some way in our life. But just like the Israelites, we're called to trust that daily provision, that it's going to be sufficient for today's needs. And we're to resist the temptation to worry about tomorrow, aren't we? We're supposed to believe that God's timing is going to test our patience, but that it's perfectly designed to grow us in all the ways that God wants to. This isn't about just feeding the Israelites. It's about forming them into a people who are going to trust him every single day. And by surrendering the anxieties of their hearts, this is the way that they will be able to meet today's challenges with faith and trust in their hearts. This is the way that God's shaping them into a people of steady trust. Not a roller coaster ride, but like ongoing, consistent trust. You're going to go out every day, you're going to gather, you're going to rest, and you're going to rely on God. You're going to have faith every day, even when the path is unclear. See, that's what God's after in their lives. It's what he's after in our lives as well. Through the daily manna, he was forming a community that was fully dependent on him and on his timing. And as they would embrace this rhythm, they would see that his provision was always exactly what they needed. Not more, not less, but precisely what they needed and precisely when they need it. And man, in our fast-paced society, in our world of self-sufficiency, I mean, this challenge to slow down and embrace God's rhythms of trust in our life, that his provision is always trustworthy, right? That it's going to come sometimes one day at a time or 1 month at a time, like right when we need it. And some of you are smiling at me because I know what you're going through. Like, you're trusting him right now, aren't you? Believe this, friends. It's always enough. It always arrives just at the right moment, just at the right degree that God believes will produce the right growth in your life and mine. And then make note of this. When God tests, point number 3, he expects you to check your complaints. We certainly can't miss that point in this passage. Most of the verses are not telling us very favorable things about the grumbling hearts of these people, are they? Follow along in verse 6. So Moses and Aaron said to all the people of Israel, "At evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt." Like, do I need to remind you? Egypt is not where you people want to be. The Lord brought you out of Egypt, right? Verse 7, "And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your grumbling against the Lord. For what are we that you grumble against us?" says Aaron and Moses. And Moses said, "When the Lord gives you in the evening meat to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, because the Lord has heard your grumbling, that you grumble against him, what are we? Your grumbling is not against us, but against the Lord." Then Moses said to Aaron, "Say to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, come near before the Lord, for he has heard your grumbling." And as soon as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the people of Israel, they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord said to Moses, "I have heard the grumbling of the people of Israel. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat, and in the morning you shall be filled with bread, and then you shall know that I am the Lord your God." All right, we learned something really awesome here about the nature of grumbling, something critical about its effects in our lives. That grumbling is not just venting frustration. Venting reveals a much deeper issue of the heart. I want you to notice what Moses' response is here to the people who openly criticize him and Aaron for leading them into the desert. He says in verse 8, "The Lord has heard your grumbling that you grumble against him." Think about that the next time you're tempted to grumble and complain, right? The Lord heard it. And then he goes on and he adds, "Your grumbling that the Lord heard is not against us. It's against the Lord." So that's going to totally reframe their complaints entirely, isn't it? These grievances that seem to be aimed at the leadership, at Moses and Aaron, they are ultimately about questioning God's goodness in their lives. They're about questioning God's plan and God's provision. And so what they see as venting, God is seeing as a lack of faith and a lack of gratitude and a lack of trust. Way back in the ancient history of 1998, Kim and I spent a summer in a desert wilderness. We worked together at a summer camp out in Newberry Springs, California, and there's a desert there called the Mojave Desert. And in fact, here's a picture of what it looked like. I remember very well what it was like to live in the desert living for a summer. And I'll just tell you, hot does not even begin to describe it. Not even begin to describe it now. And I also know Floridians, anytime I say that, they're like, "Yeah, but it's a dry heat. Like, our hot is hotter than..." Listen, when it's over 120 degrees like it was multiple days that summer, that's scorching. Let me just tell you, it is hot, hot, hot. In fact, there's a place there called Death Valley where temperatures can even break 130 degrees Fahrenheit on the hottest days. And so if you just think about that for a minute, like, you can simmer a steak on a grill at 130 degrees, right? So just think about what that's doing to your body and to your skin if you're out there in those conditions for too long. The point is, desert living is no joke, even when you have the proper supplies for it. But desert living with no food, with no water, like, that's a whole different level of hardship. You try to sustain your life for very long in those kind of conditions with no food and no water, and that's a death sentence, right? You're not going to make it very long. That's real danger. And so on the one hand, it seems pretty reasonable to us, I think, that the Israelites would feel pretty desperate in this moment. Their situation really is dire, right? They have reason to be frustrated. And sometimes we rationalize when we're like, yeah, but if you knew how bad my life really was, like I'm not talking about surface level concerns here, John. I have some real needs in my life, some really big areas where I need to see God come through. But here's the thing, no matter how hard our circumstances may be, unchecked complaints are still revealing a struggle to trust God's goodness and God's timing and God's methods. They are still an offense directly against Him. Our contentment is not tied to the severity of our circumstances. It's tied to God's trustworthiness and to His character. And so complaining, while somewhat natural to us and even somewhat understandable in certain circumstances, is still something that God calls us to see very differently. He wants us to see it as He sees it. He wants us to name it what He names it. Grumbling is against Him, and it's not minor. Grumbling is not a minor issue. It's a symptom of spiritual rebellion on the inside, and it is an insult to God's very sovereignty. Every time we grumble, we're not just airing frustrations. We're doubting God's good plan. We're doubting His timing. We're doubting His care for us. Every single complaint that comes from your lips or traffics across your mind, whether you speak it out loud, whether you harbor it internally, it is a reflection of a belief that you know better than God and that He's not coming through on your terms. And here's the surprising part in this passage to me. How does God respond to complaining people like this? Well, look at verse 9. Moses tells the people, "Come near before the Lord, for He has heard your grumbling." I don't know about you, but I'm thinking this is like the teacher saying, "See me after class," right? Like, the Lord has heard what you said. And so I'm thinking, we're going to the principal's office. Somebody's about to get it, right? This is not going to end well. Somebody's about to pay. But it's amazing. Instead of harsh rebuke, God doesn't lay into them. In fact, He graciously promises to meet their very needs that they're complaining about. Look at verse 12. "At twilight, you shall eat meat." I'm thinking He's going to be like, forget it, no meat for you. No bread. No, you shall eat meat. And in the morning, you shall be filled with bread. And then, as if you don't have enough ample evidence already, once again, I'm asking you to acknowledge, says God, that I am the Lord, personal, your God. I'm here with you, and I've got this. That's God's response. And it's telling us some pretty amazing things about His character, that He is going to meet their physical hunger with His provision, but He's also interested in addressing the deeper needs of their hearts in this moment. He wants them to hunger for Him. He wants them to trust Him in the wilderness. He wants them to believe some very specific things about His power and about His trustworthiness, His presence with them. Verse 10 says there that they looked toward the wilderness, and behold, the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. I mean, what must that have looked like? Can you imagine? We're not told exactly what it looked like, but it had to be incredible. And the point is, He didn't just give them food, He gave them Himself. He showed up to remind them in the glory of this moment that He is very near to them in this wilderness. And isn't that what we need most in trials? It's not just material provision that we long for, it's the assurance that God actually knows about this situation, that He's actually here with us, that He's listening to us. This is a story that challenges us to examine our own complaints, because complaining might feel natural to you, but the Word would challenge us to see that very differently. Complaints aren't harmless. They reveal our heart's posture toward God. And grumbling might be the very thing that is choking out your gratitude in your life. You're so focused on your frustrations, and your gratitude is withering on the vine, and it's leaving very, very little room for you to trust the God who cares deeply for you. The Apostle Paul said something very similar in Philippians 2, verse 14. "Do all things without," say it, "without grumbling, without disputing." Why? "That you may be blameless and innocent children of God." See, God has a purpose for the things that you think are grumble-worthy, right? You're grumbling about the very things that God's using to bring you forth as blameless in your life. He's changing you with those harsh circumstances. And your complaining is corroding your faith. It's weakening your witness. But gratitude, by contrast, is the thing that honors God and sets that apart, sets you apart, sets you on the path toward His deliverance and His provision. And yet, again, doesn't God's response here give all of us hope? That even if you are the one here today who's had grumbling on your lips, that God's still listening. He's still providing, right? The manna and the quail, it's not, those weren't just provisions of food. They were expressions of grace for his people. Every single day, every morning, as Israel would go out to gather that manna, they had the opportunity once again to replace their grumbling heart with a heart of gratitude. And God faithfully met them there every single morning, teaching them that he alone was their source. He alone could be trusted. And that's why this passage challenges us to check our complaints, because complaints are sort of like the dashboard indicators on your car. They're showing you something about your spiritual journey. And when they start popping off, you should be concluding quickly, I don't trust God like I should, right? One pastor said it like this. I love this quote. Gratitude is the attitude that sets the altitude for living. Gratitude is the attitude that sets the altitude for living, because gratitude shifts our focus off of what we lack and puts it back where it belongs. It puts it back on the sovereign care of God. It reminds us of who he already is and what he's already done for us, right? It anchors us in his past faithfulness, and it reminds us of his future promises. But complaining, by contrast, clouds our view and makes it really, really hard for us to see God's hand at work at all. You know, I've talked to some of you even through tears who will say, I just don't see God working in my life. It's not that he's not working. It's that you're blinded to what he's really doing and what he's already done. He's always so good to me and to you. Amen? Now here's the difference between these scenarios. God's not asking us to pretend like everything's fine. I said that last week. It's not like you got to just put a plastic grin on your face and act like, oh, forget it. Like trials, what trials, right? Who cares? Just throw your hands to the wind. Like that's not the message of this passage. In fact, the Psalms, the people who wrote the Psalms, they are filled with honest cries up to God in their most desperate situations. But what I want to say to you is that there's a major difference between crying out in dependence to God versus crying out with a grumbling heart in disbelief. God welcomes honest prayers when they come from hearts of trust rather than hearts of entitlement and consumerism. Notice again in verse 12, then you shall know that I am the Lord your God. So again, the manna was not just about meeting physical needs. It was about building trust and dependence on the Lord God himself. Recognize this. Complaining is actually pulling you backward. It's elongating your stay in the wilderness. It's pulling your attention back to a false view of what's really good in the world. You're like these people saying, it was so great back in Egypt, right? You're looking to all the wrong things as the measurement of good in your life, rather than trusting God's eternal promises for you and his provisions in your life. The wilderness is where we learn that if we trust God's plan, we can experience his comfort. We can experience him meeting our very real needs. We can experience him shaping us into new people who trust him completely. We replace complaints with gratitude, and we find that God is more than enough in every single wilderness of our lives. Here's the fourth lesson that he wants to teach us when we find ourselves in a wilderness classroom. When God tests, point number 4, welcome his wonders. Welcome his wonders. As we come here to verse 13 now, we're going to see even more details of this astonishing display of God's provision out there in the wilderness. Look what it says. In the evening, quail came up and covered the camp. And in the morning, dew lay around the camp. And when the dew had gone up, there was on the face of the wilderness a fine, flake-like thing, fine as frost on the ground. When the people of Israel saw it, they said to one another, what is it? What is it, right? For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, it is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. Isn't that awesome? Hey, Josh Moody, I know you're a hunter, right? Like you're a fisherman, a hunter. You ever seen like stuff just fall out of the sky? You know, like when you're hunting birds, for example. Do they ever just fall down and say, here, eat me? No, it's usually a lot more work than this, right? I mean, this is yet another miraculous display of God's provision. Bread raining down from heaven. I mean, quail just falling before their feet to be eaten. You know, it drives me crazy, again, I've said this before, when people try to explain these miracles in Egypt or in Exodus by some natural phenomenon, right? Like I've heard people trying to explain this away and act like this was just some kind of natural occurrence. Yeah, every day in the wilderness, every single day, manna from the sky, every single day. Think about this, 2 million people in the desert. That's a lot of quail if those people are going to be full every single day. These are undeniable miracles. And when the Israelites saw this provision, it's obvious that they knew it was a miracle. They are stunned. They're familiar with quail, no doubt, but not in this abundance. And this manna was unlike anything they'd ever seen. That's why verse 15 there, they asked that question, what is it? Like, what is this? We've never seen this before. That question is the thing that ends up giving the manna its name. That's what manna means. What is it? And scholars, when you read up on this, they're going to describe it as a sweet to the palate substance, sort of like wafers dipped in honey. All right, so comparing the different places in the Bible, you can look it up. It talks about manna in different places in the scripture, and we'll learn that it's sort of off-white in color. It had a crisp texture of some sort, and it tasted sweet. So I'm thinking like Pop-Tarts. That's what this sounds like. And I would recommend the brown sugar variety, the brown ones. And I would encourage all of us to maybe eat one every day this week as a testimony that we believe in the God of Exodus, right? Pop-Tarts for everyone. Hey, Tim, can we order those up? Let's get some Pop-Tarts. But again, this wasn't just about food, okay? It was God's divine sustenance demonstrating his eternal care and his intention for his people. He was meeting their needs, but he was meeting the deeper needs of their lives. Every single morning, think about it. They walk out the door, and there it is again, enough food to feed 2 million people. Enough Pop-Tarts, enough quail. It's like Boston Market, right? Boston quail every day, rotisserie quail. Scale of this provision, I mean, it's just staggering. Like, how much quail is this? I can't even imagine it. Like 2 million birds just falling from the sky every single night. Like, that had to look miraculous in and of itself, just the act of them falling out of the air. God's overwhelming, generous, undeserved provision for his people. Psalm 78 captures this scene well. It says, God rained meat on them. It was a meat rain. It was a meat storm. It came down like dust, winged birds like the sand of the seas. And they ate and were well filled, for he gave them what they craved. Isn't that awesome? And again, lest you think that's impossible. Oh no, friend. This is God we're talking about. This is the God who parted the sea. Raining bread from heaven, raining quail from heaven. This is not a problem at all for the sovereign Lord. Not at all. He made the quail. Did you forget that? And so when the maker says, let there be quail, there is quail. I mean, think about it. If he's powerful enough to make those birds in the first place, it should come as no surprise to us at all that when he summons the birds that he made, that the birds would obey him immediately and do their job exactly as the maker says for them to do. Fly over the desert and fall on that camp and feed my people. The quail did what they were told. Behold, the care of God for his undeserving people. Another portion of Psalm 78 describes it like this. Yet he commanded the skies above and opened the doors of heaven. And he rained down on them manna to eat and gave them, I love this phrase, he gave them the grain of heaven. Man ate, look at it, he ate of the bread of the angels. He sent them food in abundance. Just let that sink in again. Man ate of the bread of the angels. God baked them bread and sent it from heaven. He gave them the grain of heaven, it says. Heavenly bread in the morning, delicious poultry in the evening. And let me just point out something remarkable here. The menu, think about it, it didn't actually depend on their attitude at all because we already saw their attitude stinks, right? This provision was not due to them having a good response in their heart. Even though they did grumble, even though they were doubting, God still provides generously this bread and this quail. His response to their complaints was not punishment, it was still provision. As one commentator said, heaven's kitchen was busy serving an ungrateful people. How often could the same be said of you and me? The same God who rained down plagues on Egypt now rains down food on his complaining, ungrateful people, using the very thing of their grumbling as the opportunity to show them something about his mercy and his provision. It's not conditional. The manna and the quail were not about meeting just physical hunger. They were about lessons in trust. God was giving them exactly what they needed every single day while teaching them to trust his character rather than trust themselves. And by providing, again, only enough for one day at a time, he's drawing them every single day into this daily rhythm of dependence on him. Every single morning, they're going to have to go out and gather that manna again. They're going to have to trust God again. They're going to have to believe that he's going to provide tomorrow again. His provision was not just a gift. It was a daily invitation to grow in their faith. And this wasn't just about bread and meat. It was about teaching them to rest in this moment as well. Verse 5 shows us that there was these clear instructions to gather, twice as much, again, on the 6th day so that they could rest, right? Rest on the Sabbath. So it wasn't just about food. It was about creating rhythms of work and rest and trust. And by commanding them here to collect enough for 2 days, they were going to have to rely on God's promise that unlike every other day where it would sour if they didn't obey, that it would actually sustain for 2 days. That they could rest and put down the work and not be stressed out about it. That they could trust God 2 days from now to provide again. I mean, think about how countercultural this is. In this fast-paced society that we lived in, this self-reliant world, like we are just constantly tempted to trust whatever we can accumulate, whatever we can get our arms around, whatever we think we can control. But God's provision challenges this mindset. He calls us instead to trust his timing, to rely directly on him every single day, to actually resist the urge to hoard and store away and worry about the future, to trust that his provision is sufficient for today and his faithfulness will meet us again for tomorrow's needs. This daily rhythm of manna is the thing that is reminding us that God's resources are actually endless, that his timing is always perfect, that his provision is exactly what we need when we need it. But how often, just like the Israelites, are we struggling to recognize all of that? We struggle to believe in God's care, especially when it doesn't match our expectations for our lives. How many times have we, like them, looked down at what God is providing and thought, like, this isn't enough, or I don't understand this. Like, what is it? Like the manna. Like, I don't even know if I can eat this, right? Like, this was not what I was counting on. Not understanding that his answer is exactly what we need to grow in our trust and our dependence. Welcoming God's wonders means receiving his provision with gratitude, even when it doesn't come in the forms that we expect. Sometimes we ask God for something very specific in prayer, and we should. He tells us to bring those requests to him. But when his answer does not look like what we envisioned, many times, just like the Israelites, we look down at his provision, and we're like, what is this? What is this provision, God? But even in those moments, God's provision is going to be seen as good in his time, right? It might not look like what you thought was coming, but trust that it's what he has for you. It's precisely what you need. I think this story really challenges us to trust God's care and timing in all areas of our lives, to believe that he always knows better than we do. It invites us to choose gratitude over grumbling. It calls us to embrace this truth of God's provision, that it's always sufficient. It would ask every one of us in this room today to open up our hearts to his wonders and find that when he provides in his way, this is for our best. It's for our good. It's for his glory. And that he's not just interested in meeting our immediate needs that are in front of us. He wants our relationship with him to deepen. Didn't you put your hand up at the beginning of the sermon saying, I want to grow this year closer to God? I'm telling you how it's going to happen. It's going to come in the wilderness as he calls you to deepen your trust in him. So let me just ask you, do you trust that God can meet every need in your life in ways that will surprise you? Do you believe that? Do you believe that he can provide in ways that go beyond what you're expecting? Beyond what you're demanding? See, the Israelites could have anticipated manna from heaven, or they would have never thought of this on their own. This was beyond their understanding. The New Testament tells us to pray that way, believe and pray that God has the ability to answer our prayers in ways that would blow our minds, right? Exceeding abundantly, above all you can ask or think. That's what he did for them. And he's the same God today. He's just as powerful. He's just as faithful. He's just as ready to meet the needs of his people when they have need. And there's one final powerful lesson that we see here in the wilderness classroom. And it is this: when God tests, point number 5, rest in his resources. Rest in his resources. How many times does God provide and it's like, still not enough, right? He actually provided. He gave you the thing you were asking for. And you can't even remember that long enough before you start asking for something else, something more. Verses 16 to 21, they reveal God's specific instructions for gathering and using the manna. Look what it says. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather of it, each one of you, as much as he can eat. You can have all you want. It's an endless buffet. You shall each take an omer according to the number of the persons that each of you has in his tent. And the people of Israel did so. They gathered, some more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, whoever gathered much had nothing left over. And whoever gathered little had no lack. Each of them gathered as much as he could eat. And Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over till the morning. But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it till the morning. And it bred worms and stank. And Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning, they gathered it, each as much as he could eat. But when the sun grew hot, it melted. So this daily collection of manna is teaching us something else crucial about our relationship with God, that it cannot be hoarded, right? Relationship with God is not something, you can't ride on your past experiences with God, right? You can't save it over for tomorrow. You can't stockpile this up as if you don't need it fresh every day. It's not good beyond today's use. Why? Because God wanted his people to rely on him every single morning. And again, this wasn't just about the food. It was about cultivating a rhythm of dependence with God himself. And so every day, he wants them to get up in the morning. He wants them to rise. He wants them to go out and trust that he's going to meet their needs for that day. Every single morning, they're reminded that apart from God's provision, they can do nothing. They will not make it in the wilderness without God. Deuteronomy 8:3 puts it plainly. God humbled you. God let you hunger and fed you with manna. He was on both sides of that. He orchestrated the hunger. He orchestrated the provision for the hunger. Why? That he might make you know, get this, friends, that man does not live by bread alone. Man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. See, this, again, it's not just about physical sustenance. It's about teaching the Israelites this lesson, to live in humble dependence on God for everything in their lives. And that's still what God is after in our lives. It's the same thing. He often gives us what we need today so that we'll trust him again tomorrow, right? Think about the Lord's Prayer where Jesus said something very similar. He taught us to pray this way. Give us this day our daily bread, right? Again, that prayer is not just about food. That's not what that's talking about. It's a call to trust God every single day to meet your needs today. To come before him every morning and recognize that I need the Lord to provide for me. Right? Just like the Israelites, we're called to recognize that our security comes from God alone. It doesn't come from our bank account. It doesn't come from our job security. It doesn't come from other resources or our plans that we've made. The practice of gathering manna ran totally counter to our human instincts. And that's why they did what they did. They disobeyed because it doesn't make sense to not stockpile when you're in the wilderness. Like, why wouldn't we save some? That seems like good stewardship if you ask me, right? But God was clear. They could not save it for later. They could not hoard it for security. Verse 19, let no one leave any of it over till the morning. So every family was to gather just enough for that day. And that limit teaches us something about contentment with God's will. It teaches us something about surrendering tomorrow on the altar of today and trusting God for tomorrow. We're not trusting in our ability to gather our own storehouse of resources, right? So, some of these Israelites, they couldn't resist, and so they hoard the manna. They think it's going to give them some greater sense of security for the next day. Or maybe they just want to sleep in and not get up in the morning. Like, I don't know what the real thought process was, but verse 20 says, as a result of this, it bred worms and it stank, right? So by clinging on to the manna with tight fists, they learned the hard way that God's provision works on God's terms. Did you hear that? God's provision works on God's terms. You do it God's way, or it will lead to rot and disappointment. But obedience, even in the desert, even in the wilderness, is the thing that brings sustenance over time. The message is very, very clear. God's saying, depend on me every single day. Do not doubt me for tomorrow. Trust me with tomorrow's needs, that I will provide when the time is here. And this is a real challenge for us. Like think about just real practically. How uneasy do you get when your fridge is nearly empty? You like that scenario very much? See, and that's not just about food, is it? It's about this feeling that we have that we need to be stocked up. Like we need to be prepared for days on end, that we got this under control. We are secure in our resources. It's the same instinct that led the Israelites here to hoard manna. They wanted to eliminate the uncertainty in their lives. They wanted to avoid the need for daily trust because they'd already banked it away, right? But God was teaching them, and He's teaching us by extension, to rest in His daily provision, not in our own efforts. He wants them to wake up every morning and say, God, provide for me again today. That's what He wants. Hearts of dependence. So the problem isn't an empty fridge, it's an empty trust in God. And just like the Israelites, we're tempted so often to rely on what we've saved up instead of trusting God to provide for us. That's why we won't give it away, by the way, also. Because we're like, that's for us, right? That's my security. Why would I be generous with other people? But God's calling us to surrender that control and rest in His care one day at a time. And this rhythm of daily provision, it's a spiritual discipline. It's going to shape the very hearts of the Israelites. They're going to have to do this on repeat for the foreseeable future. Like it's going to turn into years of this. God, I need you again. I need you today. I need to trust you to provide all over again. Even though I trusted you yesterday and you came through, I got to do it again today. It's teaching them where true security comes from. It doesn't come from our hoarded resources. It comes from the God who gives those resources. Lamentations 3 captures this so beautifully. It says, the steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. You're never going to tap Him out. You're never going to come to God and He's going to be like, oh, sorry, come back tomorrow, ran out. You were too far back in the line. No, look, I love this last phrase. They are new every morning. Mark it down, child of God. Enough mercy for every day. John Piper adds this, God's mercies are new every morning because each day only has enough mercy in it for that day. You understand what he's saying? Yesterday's mercies were for yesterday. They were for yesterday's burdens. Today's mercies are fresh for today. They're just like the manna. We can't carry them over from one day to the next. And this is the rhythm that keeps us dependent on God, sustaining us one day at a time. You say, why does it have to be that way? Why doesn't God just give us everything we need all at once? Why does He keep me under His thumb all the time as if I can never get out from underneath the pressure? It's not because yesterday's mercies were weak or insufficient. It's because God wants us to live in daily reliance on Him. He wants our lives sustained moment by moment, not by what we've stored up, but by His ongoing provision. You say, well, how can I ever get to a place where I would live this out? You do it by feasting on Christ through His Word every day. That's what we're talking about here. In John 6, Jesus references this very scene. And He explains that the manna in the wilderness was always pointed to something greater. He says this in John 6, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. And whoever believes in me shall never thirst. See, the manna pointed forward to Jesus. He's the ultimate bread of life who satisfies our deepest needs. And just as the Israelites gathered up that manna every morning, we are invited to come to Jesus every day and trust Him to sustain us and to satisfy the deepest needs of our souls. And again, this is the thing that just runs so counter to what our culture celebrates. We're told to value the opposite, to value independence and financial security. We're told to plan for every contingency possible and to ensure that we are like locked down and covered, right? And while there's wisdom in stewardship, I'm not talking about that. We have to see what the Scripture is saying today, that we're to be on guard against placing our trust in all of those resources in a way that would cause us to doubt God's provision and not depend on Him. Make note of this. True security isn't about having enough. It's about knowing God is enough. That's why you can trust Him in the wilderness. Not because of how much you have or how little you have, but because if you know God, you have everything you need. True security isn't about having enough. It's about knowing that God is enough. And that is the perspective that also reinforces the value of contentment in our lives. We live in a world that just constantly encourages us to get more, to always want more, to save more, just in case, right? Like we don't know what's coming around the bend. But God commands us and points us to a different reality. Look at Hebrews 13:5. Keep your life free from the love of money. Be content with what you have. For He has said, here's why you can be content, because God is the one who said, I will never leave you. I'll be there with you in that uncertain future. I'll be there with you when you face overwhelming needs in your life. And I will not forsake you, he says. It's not just that I'll know about it. It's not just that I'll be there. It's that I'm not going to forsake you. I'll come through. See, it's the knowledge of him with us that should be providing the rest and the contentment in our hearts that we long for. It's God's promise to provide enough for us today and that he will be there tomorrow to provide for us then too. And so as we close, let me just ask you again, where are you placing your trust? What did that look like for you over the last 7 days? You spent a lot of time thinking about that bank account? Thinking about your job security? Thinking about security in relationships? Or are you casting your cares on the Lord, relying on him and believing that his daily provision is sufficient and his faithfulness in the future will be enough? See, just like the Israelites, we are tempted to think that if we gather enough, we'll finally feel secure. But God is calling us today, friends, to trust him, to sort of let go of all of that, let go of control, and just rest in his good care for us. And it is challenging to live this way, especially in uncertain seasons. I'm not ignoring that. I'm just saying that it's waiting on God's timing and his provision that is going to stretch our patience and deepen our faith, and we have to embrace that together. But it's also a very freeing way to live, not constantly wound up about tomorrow's worries. Believing that we really can trust and rest in God's faithfulness. That's what Jesus meant when let me show you this one last passage. That's what Jesus meant in Matthew 6:34. Do not be anxious about tomorrow. Like, could he be any more clear? Stop worrying about tomorrow. Tomorrow will have enough problems for itself, right? It will be anxious for itself. Sufficient for the day, one day at a time, is its own trouble. What does that mean, sufficient? God's going to be sufficient for all the trouble you're going to face today. That's what he's saying. And so he's calling you to trust him for today's needs. He's calling you to believe that he'll be there with you for tomorrow's challenges. The Israelites had to learn this lesson, and there was no way for them to learn it apart from the wilderness. They had to go out into that desert to learn how to draw closer to God. And the manna was part of that. That every morning manna, it was an invitation constantly and a reminder that God was their sustainer. Every single day, coming back before God and receiving him as the bread of life, the good giver of all good things. And so let's bow our heads now and let's talk to him. And let's just ask him this week to press these things into us even more, reminding us that he cares deeply for his people. He's not different or distant. He's not indifferent. He's a faithful provider. And he wants to walk with us through every single wilderness season, guiding us and testing us every step of the way. He's a good, good father that we sang about just before the sermon. And even in this moment, he's drawing close to you. Do you understand that? He's leaning into the situations that are heavy on your heart. That's the purpose of your wilderness season, friend. So just take a moment there in your seat and start crying out to him. Whatever those burdens are, run to him again. You say, I did it yesterday. Right. New every morning. Call him. Was he faithful to you yesterday? You say, he didn't answer everything I asked for. Well, did he answer enough? Was he sufficient yesterday? He'll be sufficient today. Gather his mercies fresh and anew. Gather them from his word. Gather them from relationship with himself. And ask him to teach you this lesson of daily dependence on him alone.